Thanks everyone for joining in. This is Jeff Abramson. I help direct the forum on the arms trade. We will start in 2 minutes. Thank you. Well, I've been doing this for so long, I forgot to unmute. Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Abramson. I am the director of the Forum on the Arms Trade, and I'm delighted to quickly welcome you here. The Forum is a network of experts and emerging experts around the world, about 200 of us who work on arms trade, security systems, and weapons use issues. This is the fourth webinar in the past year that's actually being led by members of our emerging expert program, and I'll introduce Nai soon, who will take over. But I am here to quickly just tell you a little bit about the technology we'll be using for today's event. I know many of, or all of us have been on plenty of Zoom webinars, but in this meeting, you can use the chat. We like to leave the chat open for people to feel involved and engaged, but please put your questions in the Q&A, and you can see each other's questions and upvote those questions. So if you see a question that you think really looks great, please do upvote that so that when we get to the Q&A portion of today's webinar, we know which questions are the most popular. I'm going to now turn it over. Oh, and also, sorry, at the end of the webinar, you will be taken to a poll where it's very quick. You can just give us some feedback on how this went, and it really helps us continue to improve our events. I'm now going to turn it over to Nai Fontong, who is a member of our Emerging Expert Program, to tell you more about today's event and get us going. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you, Jeff. And a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. I am Ying Dao, and I'm honored to moderate this session organized by the Small Arms and Light Warborne Working Group of the Emerging Expert Program of the Forums on the Arm Trade. Our discussion today centers on a phenomenon that has fundamentally redrawn the global theater of our hybrid drones warfare and the futures of control regime. So when we map out the empirical evolution of commercial drones in conflict, we see a striking trajectory. So began years ago in Colombia when non-state actor uses this low-cost commercial drone for the ISR purpose to monitor the state troop movement. And then in MENA region, Middle East and the Northern Africa region, we see that these platforms has been pivoted to active combat, adapting then into an improvised bone carrier and the primitive loitering munition. And today, this low-cost technology has been widely adopted. We see it on a massive scale in the Ukraine and Russia war. We see it in Gaza, and we see it in Myanmar, where off-the-shelf systems are actively deployed by the resistance forces and the state military. The adoption of state military has flashed across border tensions, such as Thailand and Cambodia border conflict last year, and it has scaled up to the complex state-level theater of the current conflict in the Gulf region. What makes this shift unique is not just the hardware, but the wider ecology surrounded it. So this tech spread via open sources in both Myanmar and the Thai-Cambodia border dispute. Field testimony confirms that operators drew the right inspiration and tactical blueprint from Ukraine battlefields via YouTube and other crowdsourcers. So this is a decentralization of leader force, and these systems are not just economically affordable; their underlying technology is practically impossible to restrict by a traditional framework built for military-graded leader autonomous weapon system, or what we commonly call killer robots. So this complex evolution forces us to confront critical policy questions today, including the challenges that dual-use commercial drones technology pose for rigid export control system, and how these decentralized production lines and gray market model supply chain complicate state accountability. So to help us connect these dots, I'm joined by two exceptional experts, Dr. Taras Vidiagos, an assistant professor at the University of Glasgow, and also a political and economic anthropologist, studying how social movement organize to transform world economy, states, and capitalist labor and value regime. He has conducted long-term ethnographic research in Kyiv and London, exploring the civil and military networks underpinning Ukraine's war effort. Another expert is Wayne Swinnenberg, the humanitarian disarmament project leader of the Dutch peace organization PAX. His work focuses heavily on emerging military technologies, how modern wars evolve, and these structural consequences for global arms proliferation. Gentlemen, welcome. Let's dive straight in. So for the first round, I like to start with Taras. So Taras, let's start with you on the Ukraine-Russia context. So your research beautifully frames frontline drone as a authority technology, a critical weapons born out of severe shortage in conventional artillery. So could you please map out how these informal volunteer-driven procurement and commercial drone has transformed the landscape of the war, and how it blurred the line between civilian commerce and the state procurement? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nyan, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. There's been a lot of hype and excitement in certain circles and concern in others about the ways in which small drones have proliferated on the Ukrainian battlefield, the battlefield of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. But I think it's helpful when trying to think about their proliferation and use of dual use of commercial technology and for this kind of hybrid regimes warfare, it's helpful to think about the first emergence and adaptation of this commercial technology in Ukraine. And for that, we need to go back to perhaps as early as 2015, 2016, when in the context of a limited positional warfare regulated by an imperfect armistice and kind of peace regime, drones were adapted for reconnaissance, commercial drones, often those made by the Chinese manufacturer DJI, at the time I think DJI Phantoms, but adapted for reconnaissance. And very quickly, these drones were fitted with drop mechanisms, and from 2016 onwards, there were limited but repeated incidents of attacks by these drones on positions on both the separatist/Russian side and on the Ukrainian side, with grenades dropped from these drones. We've seen such use of technology elsewhere, of course, so Ukraine wasn't unique at the time, but it was the use of these drones was connected to the rise and institutionalization of a civic movement of crowdfunders or military activists that were trying to shore up the Ukrainian war effort on, and similarly in a symmetrical fashion on the separatist side. And the Russo-Ukrainian war that scale up in 2022 with the Russian invasion only basically wrote large that script on a much larger scale. The same crowdfunded groups mobilized again. The script of crowdfunding, the scales of crowdfunding often focus on drones and providing drones from bottom commercial platforms imported from China or from elsewhere, scaled up to probably hundreds of thousands of people. And since then, that transformed in ways that interestingly complicate the idea of dual use and also of control. In 2022, 2023, most drones that were being provided by civic crowdfunding agents or bought by military servicemen themselves without any or with very limited support of the state. They were off-the-shelf, commercially available drones that, however, with some efforts from China and the producer companies to limit their export, pushed these crowdfunders to start setting up not just supply chains into Ukraine and training grounds and facilities and programs for training pilots, but also to start importing components for assembling a different kind of drone with the related technology, the first-person view racing drone that would be used not for dropping munitions, small munitions, 40 millimeter grenade retrofitted for to be able to explode when not launched from an automated grenade launcher, but when dropped from above. But that would be adapted, these drones, for carrying an RPG round or a similar kind of improvised explosive device that often would be produced in a workshop right there on the front line. And this technology the adoption of this technology led to emergence of many workshops, basically cottage industry / innovations ecosystem, depending on how you see it, on the front line on the Ukrainian side, and then also increasingly on the Russian side. The context of shortages of artillery munitions in late 2024, late 2023, early 2024, led to a push by the same crowdfunders to start lobbying the Ukrainian state to begin purchasing these drones, most of them in no way certified or registered with the Ukrainian government, right? Of different designs and different makes, to start purchasing them officially. And that began happening from late 2023. I could talk more later on about how that happened, but basically, with this proliferation of different kinds of makes and models, with increasingly localized production in the country, with greater value added being retained in production in the country, with attempts to reduce reliance on spare parts for Chinese and generally East Asian and Southeast Asian producers, we see an explosion basically of the volume of production. In a scale of about a year, from mid-2023 to mid-2024, we go from several dozen thousand drones produced per month to about 100,000, 120,000 drones produced every month. And that has only increased. This year, Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, is intending to purchase officially by the state about 6 million drones. This has also led to a transformation of procurement regimes that had to accommodate this diversity. And I suppose what began as a kind of an adaptation to a shortage, a form of an austerity technology, has been scaled up with the participation of the state to the point where what began as an off-the-shelf commercial use or dual use tech or product became adapted and has become very much a specifically built product for military use, right? So we have this transition from dual use back into military use, with, however, in the middle, the proliferation not just of the technology itself, of blueprints, but also of knowledge of production, of production sites, which maybe some of them might get out of business at some point, or not survive the harsh competition in Ukraine and redirect production to elsewhere. We've seen an emergence of an attempted export control regime, and really just a massive proliferation of skills, of piloting, of IED and explosive adaptation and IED production across dozens of thousands of people in the Ukrainian armed forces and outside. So I just want to summarize, want to point to the way in which, when looking at this particular technology, it's very important to keep in mind the context for its emergence and its use, because that way you see that attempts at control should be focused not just on the proliferation of the physical thing itself, but also of knowledge, of data, of skills, control of production capacities, and supply chains of spare parts. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for highlighting the intersection of decentralized innovation and volunteer logistics. So let's move to Wayne. Wayne, Let's pivot to the Middle East. So in the theater, we see state actors and regional proxy deploying loitering munition on a highly synchronized massive scale. So based on your tracking log, how has this state level adaptation reshaped our traditional concepts of force protection and cost asymmetry? And what does this situation doctrine mean in the practice for the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure? Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks again for the invite for this panel. Looking at the use of drones in the Middle East, and I'm basically starting looking at the war that started last year from the Israeli attacks on Iran and the response to that, and also including the current strikes. There are a couple of interesting developments that were taking place. I think first of all, what started off in Iran, and we see similar patterns also in Ukraine, was the use in the country itself of smaller kind of drones. So the Israelis, in the wake of the effect, what they managed to do is build commercial weaponized drones inside Iran to take out key air defense systems. And this was particularly interesting and to some extent also disturbing because they employed local groups, in particular Afghan labor, often who didn't know what they were making. So they create hundreds of smaller kind of drones. And they were assembled by groups inside Iran and then later used by infiltration groups or other kind of state groups from Israel or Israel-supported groups to strike kind of air defense systems. That was kind of an effective way. We saw similar things also in Russia, where Ukraine used a similar kind of tactic. And in the case of Iran, it was also disturbing because of the ramifications, because Iran then later used this to expel and deport hundreds of thousands of Afghans as a result of that. But just going back to the technological part, that was like sort of the kickoff of these strikes. We also know that Israel has been using a lot of Israeli surveillance drones over Iran to map these kind of facilities. And in response, we saw over the last decade, Iran has been investing massively in constructing cheap one-way explosive drones. Kamikaze drones are their more known as, because they're cheap to construct with not very complicated materials, and able to fly over long distances and trying to either overwhelm air defenses in Israel or other areas. And this has been to some extent effective because it leads to depletion of anti-air defense systems in Israel. Whereas in 2025, Israel was able to intercept most of those, often also with help of allied air forces. But in 2026, we've seen more and more these kind of tactics that have been working. Now, fast forward to the war that started on February 28th. What was interesting in terms of developments in the use of drones in this conflict was first of all, the large-scale use of military drones by the US and Israel, but also by other Gulf states over Iran. So we saw quite a lot of footage where clearly military drones like the MQ-9 Reaper and the MQ-1 Predator and also some Israeli types of Hermes 900s were flying and anti-air defenses were not always working. At the same time, this changed, and in total, I think the losses from all the countries that used military drones over Iran was, I think, at least the US lost 24 large military drones over Iran, Israel, a couple of more as well. And like the UAE or Saudi Arabia used Chinese wing Lungs, which were shot down on some occasions over Iran. But it shows the importance of these kind of presence of these systems to track. They were able to often fly without being intercepted. But also the response was quite effective. In the longer term, we saw that Iran was able to develop an adequate response to shoot down. And we already saw this in the last 2 years, where the anti-air missiles, which were likely coming from Iran, were used by all kinds of groups in the Middle East, including the PKK in Iraq, the SDF in Syria, but also the Houthis in Yemen. They were able to shoot down a lot of these military drones. So as a reaction to these large-scale military drones, we also see states investing in taking those out. Next, we saw also the Iran, the massive use of those kind of one-way explosive drones against all kind of critical infrastructure in Gulf states. So we saw strikes on fossil fuel facilities, power plants, military bases in the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Iran, Iraq, Oman. And they've been quite because the bases are widespread and all the kind of locations are everywhere that you want to target. It's impossible to set up anti-air defenses everywhere. And often these kind of drones are able to fly under the radar and have been quite effective in such a method. So I think that also poses new challenges for responses to that. And lastly, less focus on Iran, but we do see, for example, currently where Hezbollah has been able now to effectively copy the Ukraine-Russia dynamic with fiber optic drones and effectively hitting Israeli troops inside Lebanon and on border stations. So of course, electronic warfare has been to counter and disrupt drone warfare has been developing quite rapidly. And this response to that is also now, we see that being rooted more in non-state armed groups and also armed groups in the Middle East as a response to the ability from states with more highly developed anti-air defenses to take out the drones. So I think those dynamics where the role of large-scale drones is being challenged by anti-air defense systems, the rise of one-way explosive drones, cheap, available to produce and to use, and smaller FPV drones are taking a larger role up in symmetric and asymmetric warfare. I think that's a development we also currently see in other areas in, for example, Central and West Africa.
Thank you, Wim. That's the reality of commercial components and also bring us to the machine economies. And we will back to the electronics waffle, the advanced system in the later round. But now I would like to let's stay with you. So another question to you is when we look at this global manufacturing, you also mentioned about the China's the role of China and the Chinese market have. You also mentioned about that. So the China has imposed the regulation of their export control in late 2024. So and also at the same time, the West, especially EU, has also make a push toward like kind of clean drone supply chain, purging this Chinese component software and the raw materials entirely. So do you see this initiative or the broader democratic drone alliance forming between the West and the partners like Taiwan and the South Korea becoming an asset for international control regimes, or they are simply manufacturing the global, or they're simply fracturing the global commercial market?
Well, looking at Iran specifically or the Middle East, I think the nature of particularly the one-way explosive drones is that they are easy to manufacture, bring out, having a really high advanced technological market. So you need to build like proper frames. You need to have an engine. Often these are cheap engines, which can be either produced or imported. And often we see with these one-way explosive drones, these are often Asian or Chinese produced engines that are used in these kind of drones. But and you need a guidance system, which is often, the basic technology that's in smartphones that can be used. So they're less reliable on, in that sense, the high quality technological sectors that which you need for producing the more larger military drones. And when it comes to the quadcopter, small commercial drones, as we've seen also in Ukraine, I'm pretty sure Taras can speak to that as well. There's also relatively easy domestic production of these smaller quadcopter drones where there's less reliance. I think mostly it's the importing chips and other kind of specialized components in large volumes, that's essential for setting up large-scale production lines. We see also, of course, the exchange between Iran and Russia in terms of Iran supporting Russia with setting up larger drone facilities, but also we've seen Russian-produced drones coming back to Iran and have been used in strikes on Gulf states. So this interchange of expertise and experience and technologies, I think they're also trying to be less dependent on large-scale imports. I'm not familiar with the other process you were mentioning on South Korea, so I can't really speak to that. But I think the general trend is that it's to diversify different resources, be less resource dependent on one specific exporting country. We do see, however, there's a big commercial market where one-way explosive drones are. You can basically, if you want to buy them on AliExpress, they are there. If you look for them, they cost between $50,000-$17,000 without, of course, the explosive payload. So there's a whole market where this is being promoted. But you also see other states like the UAE building their own versions of it and exporting them, in particular to Sudan. Yeah, but I think in the EU, that would be good to have this kind of discussion because so much of it is purely commercial or not even dual use when it comes to parts and components of that, which is now currently not part of any arms control discussion. But we'll probably come back to that later.
Yeah, thank you. We'll usually go back in another round. So, Taras, you mentioned about there is a high volume of production in Ukraine, between 2023 and 2024. So I would like to bring it back to the market reality when a weapon is dynamically assembled out of the commercial dual-use consumer parts in the localized workshop. So what are the realistic limits of the traditional end-use monitoring?
Thanks. I think the limits are many. One of my favorite examples when thinking about the dual use and also the limits on production in Ukraine, dual use technology and the limits on production in Ukraine is that the optic fiber drones that Wim has mentioned use the same kind of optic fiber as which is used by data centers and training AI models, right? So Ukrainian drone manufacturers are directly competing for optic fiber orders with US AI data centers, and it's not the same kind of, right? So you cannot. It's very difficult to start regulating the supply of that kind of component without affecting other industries and other forms of trade. So basically, this question of dual use should be posed not necessarily even at the level of the finished product of the drone, right? But at the level of different components of the motors, batteries, radio and video units, antennae, etc. Right? So that the dual use problem in the sense is migrated down the stack of technology to the component level, where any kind of existing export control loses part of its traction. In Ukraine, in fact, there were import regulations up until I think 2023 that required registration and then use certificates for civilian drones because they had been recognized as dual-use technology. But civilian crowdfunders and the military had lobbied against those regulations to ease the import of drones into the country, given the massive need for them on the front line. So if you think about this traditional control regimes and frameworks which were built for bilateral state-to-state transfers, they have limited purchase in the country, given that Ukrainian drone economy is decentralized, partially crowdfunded, runs on not even dual use but civilian components, and is co-produced between state actors, private actors, who many of them don't even register as any kind of military producers, right? Because they can be producing for different kinds of markets, and civil society actors who fund some of that, do some of the work of logistics, smuggle in part of the components into the country, etc. That, as I've said, produced a complicated, diversified, decentralized structure of the market itself, met by a decentralized form of procurement in Ukraine, multiplying the number of agents that would be subject to any kind of control regime in the country. That said, Ukraine's introducing the experts of this kind of technology were limited, and it's now the country is slowly trying to open up the experts without allowing individual producers to supply technology to any kind of end users and buyers. Instead, in the context of the Israeli war on Iran, instead trying to provide crews of special operation agents together with representatives of manufacturers of these small FPV and other kinds of kamikaze drones as part of Ukraine's diplomacy. But that is the kind of high value concentrated effort. With the evolution of drone technology, there are by now unusable kinds of drones operating on frequencies that are jammed by the enemy for both sides in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, where these lower form of technology, which cannot be used on the front line in Ukraine, could find, or there can be an incentive for them to find a buyer elsewhere. With the development of electronic warfare in the theater of war, we see a shift, at least in Ukraine, to a more modular form of production, which again means that that pushes attention to regulation of components. Many of them are just ordinary civilian components, right? Complicating this attempts at control of this broker-driven civilian adjacent supply chains. Thanks.
Thanks, Tara. So I would like to continue the flow of conversation as a back and forth between Wings and you, Taras. So the thing is, you mentioned about this technological transfer, because as in the introduction, I mentioned that this drone technology is not only about the head wall and the supply chain, it's also about this technology transfer between a group, because this technology is not restricted or limited. It's open sources. So it would be like, it's being, and then there is a question. I would like to take this opportunity that is there any indication that the UAV usage in Ukraine in 2016 took inspiration from or even benefited from technology transfer by Syrian non-state actors who use UAV similarly at the same time? So I think this question aligns with this round about this the technological transfer and the automation crisis. So I think I will open the floor for both of you to converse back and forth. Thank you.
I mean, I can talk about Ukraine. I don't know the Middle Eastern context well enough, and when maybe in the time you can come in as well. As I've said in the Q&A box, I am not aware of specific evidence of a transfer of copying of technology. At the same time, back then the technology is incredibly simple. We're talking about, if I understand the situation correctly, we're talking about a commercial drone that has a kind of a flashlight or some sort of light element which can be read off by a light sensitive diode or some other kind of light sensor on a munition dropping mechanism, right? It's not very difficult to copy that. It's not difficult to engineer, to reverse engineer that, or to, without having the blueprints, to come up with that kind of contraption to be attached to the drone. We see, in fact, this is the reason why they appeared so very quickly in Ukraine in 2022. Some of them were copies of earlier designs, others were new redesigns around existing models of commercial drones, exploiting the kind of an affordance of that technology. And I think that points to the broader problem, which is, as you mentioned, Ninian, this technology is quote unquote open source. It's designed to be that, at least in the Ukrainian theater, where civic and civic military actors are deliberately sharing this information, not constraining its circulation in almost any way, meaning that the designs and blueprints are circulating far beyond the Ukrainian theater itself, to Myanmar and to other contexts, right? I mean, we saw in Gaza that the IDF used exactly almost the same kinds of munition dropping tactics and mechanisms as Ukrainian military had used with DJI Mavic drones. So the technology is so low key that I think partly why it proliferates so widely. But you probably know better than I do on that context.
No, I think you're totally right. We see it also in the Middle East. I mean, we had the US now using their what they call the Lucas drones, which are basically a copy of the Shahed, the Iranian version. So because I think it proves it was well effective, and we see similar versions that that are popping up in Sudan, which are also based on different kind of models that are Shahed or Shahed adjacent. And we've seen the similar kind of models also adverted on Chinese websites like the one I mentioned, like AliExpress. So it's quite it's all about the aerodynamics and being able to make it fly for a longer distance, and of course then adding to that you can add all kind of other kind of technologies, as we see Ukrainian do with Starlinks to avoid electronic warfare in Russia. But it was kind of interesting also in Ukraine because there was a whole drone development from 2014 onwards where you have like all kind of versions made with components from all over the world. There was a famous case where I think back in 2019 where in Sweden all kind of cameras were stolen from police control points for speeding. And the reason they thought was like Russians stealing those kind of cameras to use them in drones. And because Russia was experimenting with, we see also Ukrainians were referring to their drones as like UN drones because it was built from parts and components from all over the world. So there's a whole innovation going on way before 2022 in Ukraine. And similar thing we see in the Middle East, like the Hezbollah was actually the first one using the quadcopter drone with drop munitions in 2015 in Syria. ISIS was a major investor in the use techniques, which was easily copied also later by other kind of groups. And then it's all about perfection and also the challenges to use how to make best use of easily available parts and components that are not regulated by the market in order to make them. I think that's we see it happening as well, and it will pose also security risk or concerns when it comes to export controls of drones in the long term. In particular, we see the massive production lines that are now being set up in the EU in collaboration with Ukraine, but also in other areas. How do you deal with this if it's not specifically military design, and I think it challenges export control norms in terms of doing risk assessments of where parts and components are being used for. But also particularly if you do domestic production centers where you basically make nuts and bolts for dropping mechanisms and rotors, etc., that can set up huge production lines for weaponized one-way commercial drones or weaponized quadcopters. I think that's also removing away a bit more from the larger, expensive drones. So it can still be effective. We see that in Sudan, where if you have like a country with vast amount of stretched land where you need to control, where you have movements of military or armed groups, and you need to do surveillance and reconnaissance, that's where these kind of large-scale military drones, because they have way better sensor systems, infrared, etc., very high resolution, that is effective for monitoring there. Although even we see in Sudan, like if you bring in anti-air defenses, a lot of these expensive Turkish drones that have been exported to Sudan have been shot down by the RSF and vice versa, where Chinese drones have been shut down. So I think there's a whole proliferation and counteraction to that. That's just part of the military domain developments. But in terms of export control, it does challenges the current export regimes, in particular those who are not part of it, who are making use of that to expand their presence on the military market and bring in their expertise.
Thank you both. So let's connect with this conversation to another, not another, but related question. So before opening up to the live question, I want to pose an Excel question submitted during the registration. So, but first, let's ground it into the tech advancement, looking at the Israel integration of advanced commercial algorithm and automated drone swarm. the tech gaps is widening. And also it's quite similar in the other region, copying the same like support from, for example, well, I'm from Myanmar, so like drawing for the case study of Myanmar, they copy or got the support for Russia. It's the similar pattern of the tech transfer, and also the another part of the device transfer. This military transfer is happening. But the question is, would drones used for military purposes that rely on dual use capable software and components be considered subject to formal military information exchange regimes? Or do they slip through the cracks of current global transparency mechanism? So either of you can take this first.
I think, I mean, we've engaged with the question already, right? I think it's pretty clear. I'm not an expert on control regimes, so I was joking before the start of the webinar that I can tell you a lot more about the proliferation than about control. But partly because of the lack of any kind of limits and regulations of this technology in Ukraine. But when we think about what slips through the cracks, right, it's not just the material components, it's also the software itself, flight that is used with for flight control. And as far as I'm aware, many of the FPV drones used in Ukraine from the start of the conflict have been using one or two kinds of software, one or two programs that have been updated, which are also used in civilian racing drones, right, for fun. It's literally the same piece of software with some kind of additions to it, perhaps for military use and for controlling communications. And likewise, thinking about what might not yet been covered by export control regimes, that's data. The scaling up of the use of drones in the country, in Ukraine, and in combination with the use of one specific platform for command and control called Delta, with multiple modules for assembling drone feeds and data about flight patterns and weather, etc., has led to accumulation of ginormous quantities of data about drone behavior and attacks, types of targets, visual identification of targets that Ukraine is now starting to bundle up. And the only reason that the country is beginning to bundle this, the only reason the country is beginning to bundle up this data for to offer to private companies and allied governments for AI training is that it had the command and control platform on which to integrate this kind of data. But before that happened, there were private actors that were beginning to offer bundles of terabytes of videos of drone flights to commercial willing customers who wanted those kinds of videos to train AI targeting algorithms and models. And that, of course, that's hugely expensive. It's less likely to be immediately of use to armed groups the world over, but this is also something I think that we need to think about when we think about regulation of the proliferation of this kind of technology. Over to you.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, it's a challenge because, it's basically a vehicle that it's a platform that it's not necessarily has a military designation. So same with cars and other kinds of platforms or vehicles. So if there's no specific military design for it, it's hard to regulate it under export control mechanisms. I mean, we've seen at least on the military ground drones, and this we try to capture, or the international community should try to capture as much as possible to prevent unwanted end users or users where there are known risks to use this kind of machines for violations of a range of international humanitarian principles or laws. So on the DTT, there are already for military drones export control guidances. In the past, we've seen at least the US, together with some European states, trying to set up some kind of control regime under the Obama, later Biden administration, which failed with no success 2 years ago. Portugal was trying to take initiative forward in the UN General Assembly with a resolution on military drones, which also didn't move forward because of the lack of support. We have some non-binding guiding principles from led by the UAE in 2023, the Abu Dhabi guiding principles to prevent terrorists getting their access to armed drones. In the principles, there are kind of recommendations for states to review kind of national legislative measures in terms of controls of commercial parts and components that can be used for assembling drones. But again, it's non-binding, it's voluntary. So it's, and in particular, considering the UAE is one of the exporter of kind of drones to groups who've been using them to violate human rights and commit genocide, as we've seen in Sudan, where currently armed drones are there, according to the latest UN report, and number one weapons being used to target civilians in 2026 at least. And also even yesterday or earlier this week, there was a strike with drones on a market killing 28 civilians. So these kind of technologies are being used more because you're able to deliver an explosive payload over long range with a very effective way. So how do you try to capture as much, or the industry community on the regulation should try to capture as much as possible. But I think under a regulatory framework, it would be near to impossible to limit the use of drones, particularly the commercial quadcopter ones. At the same time, if there are big production lines being set up everywhere, it will pose a security challenge, or it require, I think, more than ever, a more collaborative effort of civil society groups, affected communities. There are now discussions also going on within the humanitarian community because of the increased use of drones against the humanitarian operations. We've seen it in the Middle East, in Ukraine, in Africa, and it's now being flagged by both the UN organizations and humanitarian groups as a major threat to their operations. So those kind of narratives are very important to put forward on the risk imposed of drones. And I think we have to look at a new ways, or how we deal with this new, well, not new, but with these technologies that are now being mass produced, as Taras mentioned. We're talking about the millions, and also make it clear to states like there are implications, because it can also backfire. We see more criminal gangs, terrorist groups making use of armed drones or small quadcopter drones. So it will also have like national security implications in Europe, in the US, in Ukraine as well. I'm pretty sure at some point where there is a longer term peace, there are dozens of hundreds of people who are specialized in these kind of drones, who are wanted everywhere in the world for their expertise. So how do you deal with that? I think that's a major challenge now that I don't have the answers to, but I think showing the kind of risk that they pose, and I think that's where states should be sitting down together and like what's reasonable in terms of course we have seen also a lot of peaceful civilian use and all kind of utilities for these kind of drones in normal peace circumstances, but that's now the challenge that we're facing. So I think it will be export controls on large volumes of parts and components that should put up red flags for arms export or export control, even if it's dual use or civilian. That if you're getting a request for 100,000 rotor blades, smaller ones, I think as an export person, that should at least warrant some more investigation and questions to prevent it, particularly if the end destination is a risk area. So those kind of debates we should start having, which also needs to involve the police, the commercial industry, how to deal with responsible use of drones in the commercial and in the military domain currently and in the near future.
Thank you both. So there is a question, I think is for Wings. So the question is, as you talk about the Middle East, and you would the audience would appreciate if you talk about the drone scale in the African and the Middle East, drone scale in African, because Middle East states like African Middle East states like Sudan and Somalia as Arab East member states.
Yeah, sure. I think that's in Africa, that's where we see where armed drones are. I mentioned earlier Sudan, but we also see Ethiopia. It's a massive use, we see massive use of armed drones against armed groups, but also a lot of civilian casualties. I think now they're, apart from Sudan, they're ranking in the top 3 countries where armed drones are leading to civilian deaths from drone strikes. Nigeria, we've seen similar patterns. We've seen particular Turkish drones being exported to a number of African states in the last 10 years, where later on coups took place and militaries took over and now have access to these kind of drones, or not democratic elected groups that are now using these kind of drones in their operations. But also we've seen more groups willing, particular in Central Africa, getting access to commercial drones, quadcopter drones, and using them effectively, including fiber optic cable drones in Mali and Niger, and also in Nigeria. So I think that that's a trend, and there's also we've seen also a lot of experts and in general experts from terrorist groups, from and armed groups from the Middle East, supporting these kind of groups in Africa. So there's this exchange of information is now taking place there. And then states are investing massively in these kind of larger military drones. So throughout the whole of West Africa, Chinese and Turkish drones are dominating the markets there, and to some extent also Israeli drone manufacturers as well. We see more collaborations between, for example, in Sudan and Pakistan, they have a collaboration in their drone industry to build one-way explosive drones. Also, Turkey plays a role there. We see the UAE either re-exporting Chinese military drones or their domestic drones to armed groups. And we also see experts we've seen the Ukrainian experts, but also Russian experts in various conflicts who have been supporting local groups with their expertise of FPV, weaponized FPV drones. I think there have been some good reports by Drone Wars UK and some others on the scale of use of armed drones in general in Africa. And I think that's, yeah, it really goes to show that because they're relatively cheap compared with manned or crewed aircraft or like jet fighters, they require less specialized training and expertise, and easy to set up and move around throughout the country in different kind of military bases, which makes them so popular. At the same time, yeah, if you look, for example, at Sudan, where we've seen a number of very expensive Turkish drones been shot down. They're like $25 million each. At least 5 of them have been shot down in Sudan, if not more. So we can imagine as a group as the SAF, like the Sudanese Armed Forces, buying those and then losing them quite fast because of the anti-air defense system. They probably look at different types of cheaper drones. So we see also one-way explosive drones being used more and more there as well.
Thank you, Wayne. Your answer also covered the question from Gisela about the challenges of regulating and asking for the resources. And regarding that question, we will also provide the resources and the other report after this webinar as soon as possible in the follow-up report. So as the time is clocking, so I would love to hear the recommendation on the future of this drone warfare or the control regime as a closing remark. Maybe I'll start with Taras.
I think my main takeaway, and conscious that it probably is not that useful, but then I'm an anthropologist, usually complicate things rather than say something that's useful, would be to think broadly about control, not just of the transfer of technology and spare parts and hardware, but think about transfer of software and regulation of possible regulation of trade in software, transfer of skills and expertise, and monitoring of transfers of skill and expertise and of data, right? So the drones operate the particular kind of platform that requires specific forms of infrastructure, relatively complicated skills, both for in engineering and for operation. And there is an active, as Ben was just saying, there is active efforts to proliferate that in forms of blueprints, but also of direct kind of peer-to-peer learning, as it were. It's already too late to try to regulate that, but as the technology develops, there will be similar efforts to proliferate jamming and electronic warfare that are that, as we've seen in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian theater, are one of the elements that pushes the development and innovation around the drone technology and drone use in especially creating certain points of divergence in specified theaters because of elements of terrain or whatever. So basically think broadly about the different elements that create the ecosystem of drone use, from the human to the technological and the software.
Yeah, I think we'll mostly want to reiterate my last point. I think looking at specifically for the EU, because they're we're looking at what kind of policy can we influence at least as a Dutch or Western NGO, and then as engagement with the European Union. And we see a lot of the investment in the European context on building their own defense industry. The Netherlands is doing like hundreds of millions of investments in collaboration with the the Ukraine on drones. So that's why we feel like there's an opportunity to engage on like what are kind of risks and how can states like the Netherlands, but also others, address these kind of risk when setting up these drone collaboration and companies, so like responsible use, responsible exports, and also an opportunity to engage with other states in international level to raise these kind of concerns, and also proliferation concerns, bring in the humanitarian sector as well. I think there's an important voice in the whole debate because we've seen how vulnerable they are to these kind of drone strikes and how it's affecting their operations. So that could also resonate well among a broad international community that there are risks involved. Discussions on like terrorist groups, armed groups getting access to these kind of materials and or proliferation among these kind of groups should also be a major important warning for states to improve controls and discussions with exporter states or importing, set up better risk assessments and engage with the industry as part of those kind of discussions on like what is responsible route, because it's a technology that's here, it's going to be used, on the commercial level, it's going to be used on the military level, but there are negative consequences for misuse in terms of misuse, and if they end up in the wrong hands. And I think there's a debate we need to have, and that state should lead on. Address this in the right forums, address this in the UN General Assembly, in the UN Security Council, where it has been raised a couple of times already, but we have to do it more stringently. And also around relevant humanitarian forums on, what are the implications and why should we push back and why should we keep an eye on who's getting their hands on what. I think that's the best thing we can do at the moment, but yeah, it requires a more collaborated and collaboration and more joint efforts between different kind of states, humanitarian groups, civil society groups, and surviving communities to demonstrate the necessity of such an approach.
Thank you. To wrap up our conversation today, is like incredibly clear. This traditional state-to-state export control regime is facing the existential challenge, and when the primary driver of the proliferation is the dual-use nature of commercial electronics moving through the decentralized supply chain and the open source network. As also we noted about this, the governance model, even though there are non-legally binding principle, is also needs to be involved. So a massive thanks to our brilliant panelists, Taurus and Wing, for sharing your field insights today. And also thank you to Jeff and the forums on the M-Trade for hosting this session. So to our audience, a very quick feedback survey will appear on the screen. And when you exit, so could you please take a moment to complete it and keep an eye on in your inbox with the follow-up resources as one of the questions requested, and also reading recommendation and a recording of this session. So we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.